Hello and welcome to Triple Crown Wargaming, and today you've got me, the Duke, and I'm just going to be chatting about what we know about Magic in the old world, as well as what I think that we're going to get and what I'd like to see and maybe wouldn't like to see as well. Now, as with most things old world, we don't actually know for certain a lot. We've only really had one part of one development diary that's really sort of even mentioned Magic, really. I've seen a few pictures with wizards and things in, but we've only had, I think there's about 3 paragraphs, maybe, in the latest development diary that actually specifically talks about Magic. And, well, there's quite a few big things in there. I think there's one pretty obvious one in there, which I will definitely talk about in a little bit, as well as some other things which have maybe slid under some people's radar. But the first thing we're going to talk about today is the fact that I think they have made reasonably clear that the 8 laws of battle magic that or most of you are probably pretty familiar with, they're going to be gone. We're not going to have them anymore. Now, that may be what a lot of you have expected, given the timeline of when the old world game is set. This is before the Empire had the colleges of magic set up by Teclis, or with Teclis's help at least. But to be honest, before this development diary, I thought they were just going to retcon that a bit and go back on themselves. It would not be the first time they've done such a thing and say, no, actually the colleges of magic are set up. You're still going to have the law of life and death and heavens, etc. The spells would have probably done very different things, or slightly different things in some cases. But I thought we'd still have those generic laws of battle magic. But I don't think that's going to be the case. Actually, the sort of first paragraph in that development diary about magic made it actually reasonably clear that the wizards, at least the wizards in the Empire, which it seemed to be talking about, were much more free. They're untutored, I think they said, suggesting there's definitely no colleges of magic, at least at this point. They could bring them in a bit later, I suppose, if they move the timeline on a little bit, because it's not actually that far into the future in the timeline that Teclis would set up the colleges of magic. So potentially we'll see them, if we get 2nd edition or 3rd, maybe moving into the future. Who knows? Maybe sooner. Maybe just with a little like expansion, a bit like Storm of Magic was. Maybe that'll move the timeline along. Who knows? But whenever it does comes out, I don't think we will have the 8 laws of battle magic. Now, that really could mean one of two things. We'll either have army-specific laws of magic, potentially multiple, or we will have some generic laws, like the 8 laws of battle magic were, just different ones, but everyone will have access to them in some way. Now, personally, I've thought about this quite a lot, actually, since they released that development diary, which now was probably a couple of months ago, actually. And I have sort of settled on thinking that all the armies will have access to, in some way or another, those sort of generic laws of magic. Now, I don't think every army will have access to every law of magic. I think the Empire probably will. I think the High Elves will. Probably the Wood Elves. But to be honest, that's probably it, I think, as to who will have access to everything. And then the other armies will be restricted a bit like they were in 8th edition, really. So in 8th edition, although the book is not from 8th edition, but in 8th edition, the Bretonnians, outside of the Fae, the special character, they had access to heavens, life, and beasts. I think you'll have that sort of distinction as well. So in old world, Bretonnians might have access to 3 of the generic laws, a bit like they did in 8th, or 2, or maybe even 1. They might restrict it even more. Same as Tomb Kings, they'll only have access to a couple. The only sort of army that doesn't really fit into that really is Warriors of Chaos. Because obviously before Beastmen had access to their own law, as well as Law of Beasts and Shadow, I think it was, in 8th. But Warriors, I suppose they did have access to 3 of the, or 4 actually, of the generic laws, as well as their own specific laws. So I think you could see that sort of thing again, where the chaos god that they're dedicated to, restricts them in some way as to what law or laws they can take. But I don't think everyone will have access to every law, but I do think they'll all have access in some way to some of the generic laws. Now, will there be 8 of them? You know, weirdly, 8 feels like a good number. Maybe that's just because it's what we're used to. And, you know, who likes change? But I actually think 8 gives you a decent, oh, it's an even number, which I think is a good thing, to give you that sort of good and bad split, as it were. Some of them are a little less, uh, you know, black and white. Some are very much grey. But I think they'll probably be an even number. So I think really you're only going to have 6 or 8 or 10. 10 feels like a little much. 6 maybe too few, but I reckon you'll see somewhere between 6 and 10 generic laws that, like I said, a couple of the armies will have access to all of them. The rest will have access to some of them in some form or another. So that's the laws out of the way. And to be fair, I could be totally wrong on that. That's just what I think. Um, but yeah, we'll move on because otherwise I could be talking about the same thing for 10 minutes and no one wants to listen to that. So the magic phase itself, then, well, it's gone. That this is probably the clearest they've been with anything, well, maybe the fact that 20 mils are going up to 25s, but the magic phase is no more. There is no separate phase for it. How do I feel about that? Well, to be honest, cautious is probably how I would describe it. I'm really hopeful that this new way of including magic has been done well. Now they've said that you know, it will play a part in every phase of the game, and their idea behind that was that magic will always feel like it's part of the game rather than it just being restricted to one phase. I don't really subscribe to that sort of train of thought that, you know, we seem to have had, in that magic only felt like it was a part of the game for one phase. You know, that's the point of your hexes and your augments, your buffs, your debuffs. They did things that affected you in combat or maybe in shooting in the next turn. You know, and I liked that actually you did have magic having an effect across the whole turn. So maybe this is a good thing. Maybe the types of spells, the different spells being spread out across the different phases of the game will make that more obvious, and that'll be more of the case. So maybe it is a good thing. But I really hope it's not, you know, something that's lazily sort of bolted on. Because at the end of the day, to me, magic is what makes fantasy fantasy. You know, without magic, without spells and wizards, it could just be a sort of fantastical retelling of history. Really, most of the races of the Warhammer world, at least, you could probably, you know, tie them back to their real world historical counterparts. Now, my ancient history isn't the best, so I'm not going to be able to go, oh well, yeah, orcs and goblins are this, Tomb Kings are this. I mean, Tomb Kings are quite clearly Egyptians, but that was an easy one for me to pick. But I hope you sort of know what I mean, in that there's a relatively close, although probably very exaggerated, real world counterpart to a lot of the races in fantasy. And what really makes it fantasy rather than like a romanticized history, I suppose, is magic. And I really hope that we still have that feel, which is hard to sort of know, I suppose, when you're writing the rules, if the game is going to have a feel. But hopefully they've done enough, you know, playing with the rules and testing that it does have that feel. And I think additionally, I hope that it has a significant effect on the game. I hope it's not just oh, my fire wizard, for instance, casts a fireball and it kills 2 dudes, and that's magic for the turn. That would feel really, well, insignificant, really. You know, it's hard to put another word to that, and I don't think anyone really wants magic to have that little an impact. There are obviously a lot of people out there who think that magic, particularly in 8th edition, had too much of an effect on the game. I can absolutely see where a lot of those people are coming from, but I think you need a balance. You know, magic needs to do a good amount. It needs to be something that you need to think about when writing your list. You know, when you're putting together your army, I think it shouldn't just be something that you can forget about completely. You need to have some sort of answer for it if your opponent's going to bring it, or you need to think about how you want to include that in your army, I think, to really make it have a meaningful impact on the game. With there being no phase now for magic, it makes the sort of my next idea my next thing that I'm most concerned about, really, much more difficult to implement, I think, and that is the fact that I think Magic needs a resource that the player controls. Now, what I mean by that is a little bit like the power dice that we had in 8th edition. It needs to be a depletable resource that is limited. So you shouldn't just be able to go like it was in 40k. I don't know if it still is. I haven't played for a while, but like it was, where you just go, right, I want to cast this spell or this psychic power as it was in 40k. I'm just going to take a leadership test, and if I pass it, I cast the power. That's not a resource, because you can do that as many times as you like. Yes, there might be limits in the game to say, oh, this type of wizard can only do this number of spells, but there's no resource management in that, and I think that takes away such a massive tactical element of the game that, for me, I really like about 8th edition. I like that the tactics that go into how many dice am I going to throw at this spell, how many dice am I going to throw to dispel it, which is another thing entirely. They're also, to be fair, pretty clear about this. They said, you know, there is not going to be a dice pool to keep track of, or a hand of cards like there were in older editions. So we're definitely not going to have the same resources that we had before. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They could absolutely do it another way. But I really would like there to be a limited resource for Magic. To be honest, thinking about other Games Workshop games and how they've done it, like I said, 40k, that's not the way I'd do it. Lord of the Rings, however, Middle-earth strategy battle game, that I don't mind, to be fair. So that's, for those of you who don't know, they have a resource which isn't unique to Wizards, but that all Wizards will have, which is Will. And Will determines how many dice you can throw in total at casting spells or dispelling spells throughout the game. I don't think it'd work. It could work in exactly the same way for the old world, just because the games are a completely different scale. Wizards have a very different impact, I would think. But I think that's not a bad place to start. You know, a stat almost that every wizard has that determines how many dice, for instance, they could throw per turn at spells. I think that could work quite well. But some sort of resource, I think, is really important. And I touched on it before, but dispelling, I think, is going to be interesting to see what they do with it. Now, obviously, this is going to be very tied into what they do with casting spells. But we know it's definitely still a thing. You are still going to be able to have the chance to dispel spells. Part of their development diary did say that, you know, wizards need to ensure that they can counter the spells of enemy wizards. Now, when they said this, well, I mean, first of all, that's good. It's really good to know that you can dispel spells. It's not just I throw some dice, reach a number, yes, it goes off, nothing you can do about it. I like the fact you can still do something about it. But that part of the development diary where they were talking about that was talking about, you know, placements of wizards and moving wizards around, which suggests to me, and to be honest, all of us, we've obviously spoken about this in the Triple Crown Wargaming team, it suggests to all of us that actually dispelling could well have a limited range. So you might not just be able to dispel from anywhere on the table. You might have to be within, I don't know, 24 inches of the caster, for instance, or 6 inches of the target, something like that. Maybe different wizards will have different ranges. Who knows? But I think there will be some form of range to dispelling. Do I like that idea? I don't hate it as long as the ranges aren't extremely short. You know, as long as you don't say, oh, you have to be within even 12 of the caster, I think that's too short. But then that would depend on how powerful the spells are, I suppose. So in a silo, it's really hard to give an opinion. But overall, I would say no. I probably don't like it as a concept. But it's not it's not a deal breaker for me. Put it that way. I hope dispelling is a lot more interactive than something as simple as, oh, I get a dice every time you cast a spell and I just have to roll a 6 on it. You know, like it used to be, again, going back to 40k, like it used to be in 40k, Denying the Witch, I think they called it. You just rolled a dice. If you got a 6, you stopped it. I really hated that system, to be honest. There was no tactics to it. It was luck. It was just purely luck. There was nothing you could do about it, really. Again, the MESBG system, I don't think is perfect for dispelling or resisting, as they call it, in that game. But I do think it's better than just having to roll a 6 on a dice. So like I touched on earlier, for those of you who don't know, You will use your will points, relate to how many dice you can throw across the game. Choose how many dice you want to roll. You just have to, I think it's equal or beat the highest dice roll from the wizard casting it on a single dice. So if if I cast a spell and I roll a 4 and 5, you roll one dice and roll a 5, you resist my spell because you equal the 5. That's generally how it works. Not ideal, I don't think, but at least there's some resource management to it. There's some decision making going into it, and I think that's important. Really, it's the decision making. It's not, oh, this needs to be like a really in-depth, take me 10 minutes to work out what tactically the best thing to do is. I just want there to be a decision, and I think that's what both casting and dispelling really need for me to really get on board and really like this new way that magic is going to work. Something that when I was writing out the notes for this, actually, that what I wanted to say, something that popped into my head. Does that mean that if there is a range to dispelling, well, surely that would mean you're not going to be able to dispel if you don't have a wizard at all. So then does that make wizards an absolute necessity to have? Now, some would argue that wizards, Lord level wizards at least, are a necessity to have in 8th edition games, in competitive games. I can absolutely see where you're coming from, but I do think some armies can get by without them. Demons being a good example of that. And obviously dwarves aren't really included here because they don't have wizards, but they've got their rune smiths, rune lords, and I'm sure they'll have their equivalent in the old world, which are like their anti-wizards. But if dispelling does have a range, surely if you've got no wizards, you aren't going to be able to dispel. And as a concept, again, I don't really like that. I like the idea that your army has a resource, like you got dispel dice in 8th edition, that you can then use. As much as it's harder for you to dispel without a wizard, you don't get the levels added to it, at least you had a chance to do it, and I would like that chance. But yeah, just something that popped into my head, really. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about here today that I definitely want to see, and that is irresistible force, and then the flip side of that, miscasting. I really, really hope this stays in some format. I don't think it's going to be the same, double six, you're irresistible and you miscast. Not sure it's going to be able to work like that, who knows, but I really hope that it does stay in some format. I really like that risk reward that you get with Magic in 8th edition, particularly. Now, a lot of people say the risk isn't high enough for the potential reward. I totally get that, and to be honest, I'd probably agree with you in 99% of the time. So I could see Games Workshop increasing the risk, the damage you take from miscasting potentially. But on the flip side of that, if they are reducing the power of spells, reducing the impacts they have, then is that going to be a sort of a double hit for wizards? Well, their spells do less damage, or they buff you less, or debuff your opponent less, and then the risk of using them and of miscasting is so much higher. Does that just mean actually I'm basically never going to cast the spell because it doesn't do much anyway, and if I do cast it and roll whatever I need to roll for a miscast, I've got a good chance of just losing the wizard? Is that too much? I suppose it depends on what power level Games Workshop decide on for spells, how powerful those spells are, and how likely you are to miscast. If the odds of miscasting are 1 in 100, for instance, well, then the damage you take from it can be pretty big because the chances of you doing it are pretty low. But if the odds of miscasting are 1 in 6, so on average you're going to do it every game, well, then the damage you take from it needs to be considerably lower, because otherwise you just wouldn't take a wizard or wouldn't do anything with them. And I do think spells are, I think Games Workshop have said spells are definitely going to be less powerful. They're going to, I hope they're still going to be significant, but they're certainly not going to be, deciding a game on the roll of one spell. That's something they've been pretty clear about. It can still happen from what they've said. They've said it's rare, so not impossible, but unlikely. And to be honest, I like that. I like the chance that a spell is going to win you the game, but I don't think it should be every time you play with this spell, you win the game. Like a lot of people say it is with Purple Sun, or every time you've got Purple Sun against wolves or ogres or undead, you just win the game. I don't think it should be like that. I don't think that necessarily is the case, but that's a whole side point. As long as the effects of spells are still, significant enough, as long as they can make you go from, this, say, for instance, this combat's really close, or I don't think I'm going to win this combat, to, I've got this spell off, now I am going to win this combat, it should be quite comfortable. And then that itself can lead you into winning the game off of one spell, but it's not just casting the spell that's done that. It's you getting into that position, getting into that combat, knowing when to cast the spell, knowing what to do after the combat. Right, I can get through here, I can then charge around here, or reform, or do this, do that. So I don't mind that one spell is what ended up winning you the game, even on turn 2 or turn 3, because there are still things your opponent could do, after that's happened to counter it. But if they don't see it, if they aren't able to maneuver in certain ways, you can look back on it and say, yeah, that spell won me the game. But I don't think anyone would say, oh, that spell's too powerful. So it should still have a significant impact and be able to sway a combat, for instance, if it's a buff or a debuff spell. But it shouldn't just be able to wipe out 90% of your opponent's army, in the first turn. Which I don't think anyone wants that. As much as some people love the, unit killer spells. To be honest, I think they have a place in the game when, Death Stars, that sort of 1,000+ point units with all their characters, when people do run those, then I think the obvious counter to that is the unit killer spells, and that's their place in the game. But that's a whole other discussion, maybe for another time, who knows. But those are my thoughts, really, on what we know about the old world Magic. I was going to say phase, it's not a phase, we definitely know that. But how Magic is going to work in the old world, and what I think and hope, really, is going to be the case. So, overall then, bullet point analysis of what I've been chatting about for the last 20 odd minutes. 8 laws of battle magic, they're gone. I think we will have different generic laws, and everyone will have access to at least some of those in some form. We know there's going to be no magic phase. I'm really hopeful they do it well by spreading it out across the different phases of the game, because it is sort of quintessentially fantasy for me. I also really hope there is a limited resource for you to manage. Otherwise, I think Magic just becomes a bit boring. Dispelling, I think, will have a limited range on it, so you'll have to have a wizard in range. What that range is, obviously, we don't know. And I think possibly that means you aren't going to be able to dispel if you don't have a wizard, which could be quite big. Could mean wizards are an absolute necessity in every army. And I really hope that irresistible force and miscast and irresistible dispelling as well. I didn't actually say that, but I definitely would like to see irresistible dispelling still a thing as well, and potentially with higher risk in miscast, but depending on how frequent you are likely to miscast. But let me know what you think below, if you agree with me that you think we'll have some different generic laws that everyone has access to, or if you think armies will have their own unique laws of magic, for instance, or if you'd like to see it implemented in the same sort of way as it is in 40k, or another game that Games Workshop do, or otherwise. Just let me know. Let me know what you're hoping for, what you think about what they've told us about Magic so far, and anything else you'd like us to chat about, all about the old world, down below. Thank you for joining me here on YouTube, and we will see you next time.
Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share. Then head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.
What are you doing, mate?
You alright?